the voice of the valley. Your news talk station. AM 1480 WLEA.
An Alfred University professor with a Ph.D. in political science, assistant professor of political science, Dr. Jeffrey Sluyter Beltrao is our guest today to talk about the situation in the Middle East.
Next on News Talk, AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show with Kevin Doran.
Brian O'Neill in for Kevin Doran and Alfred University's Dr. Sluyter Beltrao. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here, Brian.
Wanted to give you some questions about Iraq to start out with. Could you give us a timeline of Iraq's history of different forms of government and the wars Iraq has been involved with, starting with the 1990 Gulf War going up until today?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of forms of government, starting the group that came to power, eventually led by Saddam Hussein, was the Ba'ath Party, which was kind of an Arab socialist nationalist force that was influential in a number of countries in the Middle East. But they came to power, and Hussein eventually became dictator of the country, and he remained in power, obviously, until 2003, when the U.S. invaded. But and since then, it's been a struggling democracy at best. But in terms of the wars, I think it's important to start actually with 1979 was really a turning point for the region, and that was the Iranian Revolution that brought the Ayatollah Khomeini to power and overthrew a pro-U.S. regime led by the Shah of Iran. And they had really been our sort of bulwark in the region. And when the Shah fell and was replaced by a virulently anti-U.S. regime by Khomeini, their neighbors, the Iraqis, became much more important in U.S. eyes. And when Saddam Hussein, seeing that revolution in '79, saw it as an opportunity, on the one hand, for him and for Iraq to perhaps take advantage of the fragility of the new government in Iran and take some land, take some valuable oil fields in western Iran. And also he was concerned that the Shiite majority of Iraq, he being a Sunni, right, the two major sects of Islam, Saddam is a Sunni, and the majority of his country's population is Shiite, as is the vast majority of the Iranian population. And he thought that the revolution might inspire opposition to his regime in Iraq. So he invaded Iran in 1981, I believe. And that war was a brutal war, 1981 to 1988, over 1 million people killed, most of them Iranians, and ended eventually in a truce. But it brought Hussein really close to the United States. And when he eventually, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990, he saw that as an opportunity, thinking that he was on the good side still of the United States, and that the United States government might look the other way. Invaded Kuwait, in part thinking that he could take back what he saw as historically Iraqi territory and oil fields, and using the profits from those oil fields to pay off huge war debts from the war with Iran in the 80s. Of course, the U.S. responded to that invasion of Kuwait, as did the international community through the UN Security Council resolution. The U.S. led a force that went into Kuwait, and expelled Iraq's forces. But that was a moment where much of the Middle East, the Muslim world, was concerned about Western military intervention, and it sparked. There were something like 500,000 U.S. soldiers stationed in Saudi Arabia. There was concern that Hussein might move on from Kuwait and even attack the Saudi oil fields. So that sparked a lot of concern, and among the people who was concerned were groups led by folks like bin Laden, who was at that time over fighting with a group in Afghanistan. He had just formed Al-Qaeda in 1988. It was a group of Arab fighters, foreign fighters, fighting in Afghanistan against the then Soviet Union. And his group was very upset and offered their services to the Saudis to help defend Saudi Arabia. But it was rejected. They preferred going with the U.S. military for some strange reason. But at any rate, that was really the beginning of, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the beginning of the intensification of radical Islamist opposition to the United States, which eventuated in 2001 in the 9/11 attacks. There was a series of terrorist attacks carried out by Al-Qaeda in the years leading up to 9/11. But at any rate, Iraq, after 9/11, of course, was then targeted by the Bush administration, the claims that he had weapons of mass destruction, that he was linked to Al-Qaeda, and that the U.S. would have to go in and take him out. And, of course, we know what happened thereafter. He went in March 2003, the U.S. went in and removed him from power. And throughout the course of the years that followed then, what the Bush administration had hoped would be a quick victory and the building up of a new Iraqi regime that would be pro-U.S. and democratic and such, of course, didn't happen. It was a period of tremendous chaos and basically civil war especially between Sunni and Shiite.
Big name that we're hearing now in the news lately is ISIS. I guess that stands for Islamic State of Iraq. They're being reported as being an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. ISIS has taken over the city of Mosul, and they promise more fighting in other cities. It's being reported that ISIS wants to set up the Islamic State or Caliphate. Those who want U.S. intervention in Iraq, again, would argue that America's pulling out in 2011 has made it worse for the Iraqis and destabilizes the region. The anti-war movement would argue that the history of Iraq is filled with what they call British or American interference. Their words, not mine. And they would say that the U.S. wanting to get back into situation, they'd be a little suspicious of that it's oil-driven or military-industrial complex motivated. Your thoughts on those two differing views, and are things in Iraq more complicated than the pro-war and anti-war groups present?
Well, yeah. It's both. I mean, I think they're both right. I mean, unquestionably, the U.S. military withdrawal in 2010 has contributed to a less stable Iraq. No question about that. On the other hand, there is a long history of Western interference or intervention in the region, which is pretty unquestionable as well. And the question of whether the U.S. or the West or the British can ever stabilize the country by intervening militarily is also an open one. So, I mean, I think both sides have plenty of truth to deal with in their positions. At the same time, it's much more complicated. You mentioned the ISIS, and I mean, they are a product of an incredibly complex process of evolution in which Al-Qaeda, which of course there was no Al-Qaeda presence in Iraq before the U.S. invasion, and after the invasion, the groups took hold, led by a Jordanian named Zarqawi. And those groups then expanded, and when the Syrian war opened up, the Syrian civil war, the struggle against Assad, that provided new opportunities for them. And the Al-Qaeda in Iraq created a new offshoot called the Al-Nusra Front in Syria, and they were doing so well that the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, al-Baghdadi, he decided to send his own forces into Syria, and that became ISIS. And those two groups then became competitors, and the ISIS was actually expelled from Al-Qaeda this past February because they had disagreed with the leadership's preference for a more pragmatic, moderate approach to fighting against Assad, unifying Sunni forces there. And they've been extreme in their behavior and in their ideology and their brutality. And so they've been kicked out of Syria, basically kicked out of Syria by united opposition against them. And this force, this brutal, formerly Al-Qaeda force, is now heading down into Iraq and taking over parts of Iraq. And so it's a fascinating and horrifying scenario.
We're on the Newsmaker Show. Brian O'Neill filling in for Kevin Dorn. We're talking with Dr. Jeffrey Sluyter Beltrao, an assistant professor of social sciences at Alfred University. We're talking about the Middle East today. Moving on to the topic of Afghanistan. Of course, as you spoke on, the modern situation between the U.S. and Afghanistan started September 11, 2001. In October of 2001, the U.S. sent forces into Afghanistan. President George W. Bush, and then he also sent troops over in 2008. President Obama sends more starting in 2009. Obama announced about 3 weeks ago he wants to pull all troops out by 2016. The most recent big news out of Afghanistan was the U.S. Taliban prisoner swap. 5 Taliban prisoners were exchanged for U.S. Army Sergeant Bo Bergdahl. The conservatives in America, they denounce Bergdahl as a deserter. They say the deal was not worth it, meaning he was not worth it. The liberals in America say Bergdahl was gotten out because we always get our soldiers out, no matter what the soldiers' baggage or history is. First question on the Bergdahl situation, what do we know about how this is being perceived in Afghanistan and other parts of the Middle East, the Bergdahl swap?
Yeah, I can't say. I mean, I don't read any Afghan news sources or have Afghan friends that talk about it. I'm not sure how it's perceived in Afghanistan, but I do read certain sectors of the Middle Eastern press. And, I mean, the basic take on it, I think, outside the U.S. in general is that this is, a political football in the U.S. It's a big political issue in the U.S., but it's pretty small cheese compared to larger issues that need to be addressed in the region. I don't think they really pay that much attention to it, except to the degree that the Bergdahl swap was perhaps an early step in a process of negotiated peace settlement. Then, of course, another big issue in Afghanistan beyond Bergdahl is the elections and who the next president will be and what the implications are for the withdrawal agreement, which has yet to be worked out with the United States, and there are a lot of concerns that it might go in a similar direction to the one that we followed in Iraq. So.
We're talking with Alfred University professor Dr. Jeffrey Sluyter Beltrao, and when we get back, we'll talk about Benghazi, Russia, and the Ukraine. Back on the Newsmaker Show, Brian O'Neill in for Kevin Dorn. On today with us is Dr. Jeffrey Sluyter Beltrao from Alfred University. Jeff, the attack on Benghazi, that's being held up by the right as the biggest reason that former U.S. Secretary of State Clinton should not be president. The latest on Benghazi, Fox News says that a memo sent out by the Department of Defense listed the suspects in the Benghazi attack as having al-Qaeda ties, which contradicts the official White House story about the video being the reason that the groups went on the attack against the embassy in Benghazi. Hillary Clinton ended up stepping down largely because of this. John Kerry took over at the State Department. Wondering, Jeff, does the lack of a military response from the U.S., as conservative critics would allege, create sort of a wimp image for the U.S. and invite more of the same? Or would you say maybe, as the left would say, the rest of the world is relieved that America resisted another war in the Middle East?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that much of the world is probably pleased that the Benghazi incident did not produce a major response from the United States. These types of things have happened, as terrible as they are, and to respond with a military attack, especially given the fact that this was not, Reagan in 1986 responded with strikes on Libya when Gaddafi was held responsible for a Berlin discotheque terrorist attack. But this is not the government of Libya. These are Libya since we helped to take out Gaddafi a couple of years ago. Libya has been torn by civil strife, warlord, militia group type chaos, and much of not chaos, but certainly instability. There's no serious government controlling the country. So how do you respond to that? I mean, what are the dangers of responding with some sort of major intervention that could get us involved in quite a messy situation? So I don't think the Republicans really, if they had been in power, would probably have seriously considered a large military response to that, certainly that situation. You know, the killing of the 4 Americans at the conflict.
Moving on to the Russia and Ukraine situation. Friday morning, there were reports of Russian tanks coming into the Ukraine. Russia denied this. This followed news from last month that thousands of Russian troops had left the Ukraine. Question for you, Jeff. If the communists are no longer running Russia, why is Russia acting this way? What's the motivation here?
Yeah, I don't think it has anything to do with ideology. I think it has a lot to do with nationalism. If you look at anyone familiar with Russian history, back at least a couple hundred years to Napoleon's invasion, would be well aware that Russia has long been extremely sensitive to its vulnerability to attack from the West, and so a very strong theme of Russian nationalism is defending against that threat. And during the Cold War, of course, they had buffer states, the sort of what we termed at least buffer states in Eastern Europe. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, all those buffer states fell one by one and turned to the West. And when Gorbachev and Reagan came to sort of an understanding, and followed up by the first President Bush's understanding with Gorbachev about what the new post-Cold War world would look like, there were commitments made to the Russian leadership that NATO in particular would not expand right up to the borders of Russia. And that's exactly what's happening. And so, I mean, I think if you're a leader of Russia, you could not possibly politically survive if you did not do more or less what Putin is doing. And of course, he's been very popular. I mean, he has massive popular support in Russia for his response to the Ukrainian crisis.
And final question for you, Jeff. September 13, 2013, you were on a panel at Alfred University along with Dr. Ostrauer and Dr. Westacott and Dr. Heinemann. And you spoke at that time about the idea of the Americans using their soft power or powers of persuasion instead of military power to try to influence world politics. Would you say that comes close to the Obama doctrine, that Obama has been trying to do that?
I think it's fair to, I think it's very fair to say that the Obama administration and President Obama himself has an understanding of the world that suggests that we're in a new global era. And in that global era, for a number of reasons, including the nature of communications technology and the changing nature of warfare, it's just not possible for the U.S. to remain in its Cold War role of, policeman for the free world. That if we would end up destroying our economy, as we're already threatening to do, and that we have to be able to recognize the need to pull back and to rely more on other countries and other governments to help preserve the peace. And so, in doing so, we're going to need to rely from that kind of perspective. You would need to rely more on what we call soft power, the possibility, the power to persuade people to sort of do what we'd like them to do or to be in our camp rather than to compel them through military coercion. So, I think it's very fair to say that he's trying to move in that direction very clearly.
Dr. Jeffrey Sluyter, Beltrao, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Alfred University, I want to thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank
you, Brian.